After a couple of weeks of cooling off and letting the scars heal from the less than perfect build experience, it was time to come back and get some paint on the IBG model Panzer II. G'day guys, I'm Clayton and this is Workbench Hobbies. When I left off, the model had received an undercoat of Mr. Surfacer Black and was set aside to dry. And like I mentioned, I chose the black base in order to try and maintain some depth in the Panzer Grey, as I was planning on contrasting the finish with a lot of dusty tones, so the dark grey should work well with that effect. The model was then sprayed with XF63 German Grey. It's important to slowly build up the coat in a random application to ensure mottled glimpses of the black base can still add some depth to the colour. These Tamiya paints have a very good coverage, which is great, but when you're wanting the black from beneath to show through, you must ensure to thin them adequately. I'm using about a 50-50 mix of paint with Tamiya retarder thinner. The German Grey is then lightened using sand from the AK Real Colors range. The lightened colour is then used to create further variation to hatches and horizontal surfaces. The Tamiya and AK Real Colour paints mix beautifully as long as you are using a lacquer-based thinner and not water. One of my subscribers suggested using a flesh colour to lighten my German Grey rather than a white, so with that advice in mind, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to try it out. By using the sand colour rather than a white to lighten the paint mix, I was able to maintain the warmth in the grey rather than desaturating it. When applying the highlights, I'm focusing on predominantly horizontal surfaces and the small details like the commander's hatch and raised details. I've never been much of a fan of the structured highlighting where sharp edges are defined. To my eye, it looks a little lineal and unnatural, and that's why I take the top-down approach and look to feather the gradients. The highlighting phase will be done in two stages, with the second layer of the highlighting achieved by simply adding more of the sand colour to the grey mix and concentrating on a smaller coverage area than the layer before. After assessing the finish on the paintwork, I felt that the decals would behave themselves well enough and didn't see a need to apply a varnish prior to decaling. The subject I'm planning on building was from the 10th Panzer Division and was seen on the battlefields of France around May and June of 1940, so the appropriate decals were removed from the sheet. The closer you can cut to the actual marking without going into it, the better, as it will disguise any of the clear carrier film on the decal once it's on your model. The markings are placed in water and after about 60 seconds they are ready to fit to the model. The surface is first moistened with a brush and water and the decal is slid into place. You see I'm using a toothpick to move the marking around the model, however caution must be taken when doing this because it is possible to damage the decal by poking and prodding at it with anything remotely sharp. Once in place, a cotton bud is used to move any air and water from under the marking. The number on the rear of the turret spills across the vision hatch, so in order to help it settle in place, a touch of decal softener is used. The area is coated in the fluid and left to sit for around 5 minutes, and after that time, a cotton bud is used again to help settle it in place. A quick word of warning though, I have had issues in the past with the decal softener staining the paintwork. It leaves, or at least can leave, something that looks like a bit of a water stain or a watermark. So when applying it, Be sure to concentrate on the decal and keep an eye on it affecting the surrounding paint. If for any reason it looks to be staining, flood the area with water and dry it off. To better help the decal set in place, a sharp blade is used to trim it into the recesses. The kit decals come with the placards for the fire extinguishers, which is a nice touch, and I always find these little details can make a big difference to your model. Whilst I'm talking about tools, an upgrade here is probably worth considering. There are many 3D and etch options available on the market, and essentially there should be an additional lever on the handles, as you can see in the image on the screen. And looking at the model now, I kind of regret not doing it, but I recall at the time of the build simply not wanting to put any more money into the kit. I now move to painting some of the details around the model. So things like the gun barrels and the tools and the aerial are picked out using acrylic paints and a fine brush. Cork Brown from AK Gen 3 Acrylics is a great base colour for anything timber. The jack block is painted in the colour to set the foundations of that part. When painting with acrylic, it's important to remember to keep the paint thin and build your coverage up in multiple layers. Be sure to let the layers dry properly before painting them again. These paints are true acrylics, so they are thinned with water and dry quite quickly. The handles of the tools are also painted in the cork brown using a fine brush. Grey blue is used to paint the metallic surfaces of the tools, and this again is just a foundation layer, and subsequent weathering and painting will bring these parts to life. Black grey from Vallejo is used for the barrels, and this won't be the final finish. It's like the steps before it, just a foundation for the steps that will follow. The rubber sections around the spare wheel are also re-established at this stage. The handles of the wire cutters are painted using a rust colour, and interestingly, the handles of these wire cutters were actually insulated in pressed paper and had Bakelite ends. And the look and the colour was quite unique and presents us with an opportunity to add a pop of colour to the model. Washes will tone the effect down, but the rust base gives an ideal starting point for this tool's handles. Once the paint is dry, an all-over coat of semi-gloss clear was applied to the model. I'm back to the Tamiya paints, which are an acrylic lacquer. I'm using this because once dry, it's a lot stronger than the acrylics are and will handle the weathering, generally speaking, better than the true acrylics would. The varnish seals the decals as well as the paintwork, so it's always a good idea to sneak this process into your builds at this stage as a bit of an insurance policy. With the varnish now dry, I wasn't entirely happy with the contrast in the greys, plus the decal softener had slightly stained some small areas on the left hand side of the turret, so an even further lightened mix of the German grey and sand was selectively sprayed to horizontal surfaces and used to blend in the small stained areas. The gloss levels in the varnish can tend to make the model appear darker, whilst matting it down at the end should lighten things back up again, but I wanted to create a greater contrast, knowing the enamel washes that would follow would visually deepen everything. So the lighter at this stage I could go, the better it would be. I was going to leave painting the stowage till the end, mainly because I find it a bit of a chore, but I decided to eat the frog and paint it now. I do have a few ideas to enhance this area, but I'll leave that for another time. So for now, it's just about painting what's there and seeing how the process pans out. A field grey paint was used as the base colour of the tarp, and I tried to paint the stowage one element at a time and work from the lowest pieces up. Artistic license is a bit of a given here, just so the bits and pieces look interesting and varied on the model. Some of the timber elements are now painted in a Waffen red-brown, and I'm trying to vary the colours for the elements that have the same finish, And what I mean by that is I don't want all the timber elements to be the one colour, and likewise, I don't want all the bed rolls and tarps to look the same either. So further to that, I now head back to the cork brown to paint some of the other timber items around the stowage pile. I know I stated earlier, but patience really is the key when painting something like this, and unfortunately it isn't one of my strong points. Build the colours up one layer at a time. A successful paint finish usually takes at least 3 coats to achieve a clean and even coverage. Khaki is the predominant colour for the foundation of the bed rolls, and I'll be looking to tweak these colours with highlights and washes shortly, so for now it's just about getting the paint on the parts. I wanted to do something a little different for one of the crates in the jerry can, and I was looking to chip them and give them a worn look. So for that reason the jerry can was painted in a black-brown colour. This will represent the chipping colour once I'm done. Moving back to the tarp now, and a lightened mix of the field grey is created by mixing the field grey with a grey-green. The paint is mixed on a wet palette. Now the wet palette will ensure the paint doesn't dry too quickly and allows me a greater working window. I'm looking to get a shade that is close to the base colour but light enough to represent a highlight. A heavily thin mix is then used around the raised edges and exposed edges of the surface of the tarp. I'm using a fairly broad coverage and keeping the paint wet so it will tend to blend into the darker colour. Moving around the part in a methodical way ensures none of the areas are neglected. This layer is again built up in 2 to 3 coats and should be a gradual process. Just assess your work as you go. An even lighter mix is then applied, but this time I'm working on an even smaller surface area, so the highest points and the edges of the tarp are subject to the greatest attention. In the spirit of highlighting, the bed rolls are next in line, and the base khaki is lightened with a sand colour, and just like I did with the tarp, the highlight layers are applied over the contours of the part. The lightened colour also works to represent light chipping around some of the timber elements. The pure light sand acrylic is then used to pick out the straps on the rolls, and by using the lighter colour I'm able to exaggerate the section and help better define the part. Variation in the timber grain is also painted on using a fine brush. I wanted to try something a little different with a couple of the elements, and whilst I could have brush painted this, I like the effect that chipping fluid can give, so one of the crates and the jerry can were loosely masked using some tape. It didn't have to be perfect, it just had to offer some protection to the parts that were sitting around them. The chipping fluid was applied in 2 coats. It dries very quickly, so was ready for the top coat within about 5 minutes. Swapping back to my preferred airbrush now to apply the medium grey from AK Real Colour. The Real Colour range is a lot like the Tamiya paints as mentioned, in that it is an acrylic lacquer and it's a lot harder wearing than the true acrylics. I am however using it now because of the control I can get with the paint through this airbrush, in the hope to avoid overspray, because overspray will be problematic. The grey was carefully applied in light coats to the jerry can and the crate. Almost immediately the parts were moistened with water and a soft brush, and after about a minute or so I began the chipping process by simply scrubbing at the part. Different brushes will give different results, so I'd urge you to try the technique for yourself and have some fun with it. Even a toothpick or an old airbrush needle can be used to create refined and purposeful chipping effects. Because this Panzer II was pretty much an early war prototype tank, I was mindful to not go bashing it up too much. However, scuffs and superficial chipping was something that would happen quite easily and would add a little bit more interest to that monotone scheme. Basalt grey and light grey were mixed on the wet palette to give me a mid-tone grey that would be visible on the base colour but wouldn't be too bright and wouldn't look odd. This is a matter of trial and error, and a thinned mix of the paint will generally tend to dry darker than how it looks like it's going on. It's a good idea to test the paint on the underside of the model before committing to the top side to avoid any mishaps. Once happy with the mix, a fine brush is used to add the chips and scuffs around the model. I'm focusing on the high points and edges around the hatches and handles. I try to work on the top-down approach again so I don't miss any sections, although that doesn't always happen as it should. I focus the heaviest wear around high traffic areas and the sections like the toolbox at the rear of the vehicle. A sponge is then used with the same mix of the grey paint to create further depth on the high wear areas. I'm not planning on adding any dark chipping, as this is just supposed to represent superficial chipping, so I'm looking to make sure it will be noticeable without being overstated. The cradle for the aerial was actually made of timber, so fine chipping in the wood colour is applied to the leading edges and painted around the part, and it's another interesting detail that can be added to your build. Time for one of the most powerful tools in the modeller's toolkit, a pin wash. I believe it is the foundation of a successful model, and anyone starting out wanting to improve their model should look no further than learn how to choose and apply a pin wash. I won't confuse it too much, but I'm using an enamel paint for this wash because the enamel won't affect the paint layers I've used on the model. What that means is I'll be able to manipulate this layer without damaging the paint below it. A pre-mixed thinned wash brown blue from AK Interactive is the first point of call for my pin wash. A liner brush is loaded with the paint, and by touching it around recesses and raised details, the paint should start to run around these sections. Don't worry too much if it's a little messy, as it can be tidied up later. The effect can be multiplied, so it is possible to go over the same sections if you need to build the depth of the wash up a little more. Once the wash has had about an hour to dry off, I went back with a soft brush with a light touch of white spirit and looked to clean up the wash in the areas where it got a little messy. By moving the brush in a purposeful way and blending the colour around the edges, I'm able to create a softer transition between the colour on the model and the wash. You can immediately see the depth and the tones the wash adds to the model. It's also possible to use a soft makeup sponge to tidy up the wash, but this will only be successful if you move quickly after the wash has been applied. It must be touch dry but not cured fully for this to work. Moving now to a brown enamel wash to use around the stowage on the rear deck. The brown tones will tend to work better with the colours I've used on these parts. The brown wash can also be added to selected places around the tank to represent staining and discoloration on panels. Rusty enamels are then flooded over the metal tools, and the rust tones work over the grey base I painted earlier to present the look of used steel. Time for one last piece of the puzzle, and that is polishing the running gear and the rims on the wheels. Reference images clearly show the polished elements around the wheels and on the sprockets. An aluminium colour is used to brush paint the effect on the parts. Access was extremely awkward and made this process a bit of a nightmare, and the wheels look like a bit of a dog's breakfast at this stage, but again, this is just a foundation step and a case of the weathering to follow finishing the effect. The headlights are also painted with the aluminium colour and the clear parts are set into the recesses. They say time heals all wounds, and with the paint now in place and the initial stages of the weathering started, I'm looking at the model a little more fondly than I was a few weeks ago. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, and the macro lens is certainly magnifying my sins. But in saying that, I know that once the actual weathering begins, most of the areas that make me cringe will be addressed, and just like the build phase, will become a distant memory. One thing I've learnt with modelling is don't judge the model before you've finished. Back yourself and have faith in the process, and know that, generally speaking, everything will come together in the end. Be sure to check in a couple of weeks for the final weathering of this model. I'm planning on trying a few different techniques, so I will be firmly leaning on taking that leap of faith. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a like and be sure to subscribe. This is the greatest hobby in the world, so be sure to share it with your friends and connect with your community. Be kind to each other and be sure to be kind to yourselves. It's so important. Thank you for allowing me on your screens. I'll see you all again in a couple of weeks. See you soon.
Oh yeah!